She was 33 years old, alone in a rented room above a feed store, when she counted out the last of her money and found that it came to $9.40. Her husband, Daniel Calloway, had been 11 months in the ground, taken by a lung fever that came down off the Wind River peaks one bitter January and would not let him go. And the bank that held their note on Calloway draw, the very bank his own grandfather had helped found, did not wait out a single morning season before it took the house, the horses, and the fenced bottomland along the creek. All that remained to her was that thin fold of coin and a stubbornness she did not entirely trust herself to have. So when the county clerk auctioned off a strip of forgotten high country that nobody in Piney Ford wanted, ground the old-timers called cursed and would not run stock upon, she paid her $9 for it and told herself she was being practical. She was not being practical. She was walking through the only door left standing. And not one soul in that town, not even the men who sold it to her so cheaply and so gladly, understood that something had been waiting up there in the rock for 90 years, sealed and silent, for someone exactly like her to come and find it. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Bethany Calloway. If you have ever staked the whole of your future on a piece of ground nobody else wanted, we would love to hear about it in the comments below, and we invite you to stay with us, because Bethany's story is one you will want to follow clear through to its quiet, astonishing end. Bethany had not been born to softness, and this, more than anything, was what let her stand in that auction yard without her hands shaking. She had grown up 30 miles north of Piney Ford, in a cabin her father built with his own axe on a claim that the county surveyor's map still listed, incorrectly, as unclaimed. Her father, Amos Fairweather, had walked west with a compass, a level, and a Bible, and had made his modest living reading the land for other men, laying section lines through country that did not want to be measured. He taught his daughter, in the absence of sons, the things he might have taught a boy: how to read a sky the color of a bruise and know how many hours remained before the weather broke over you, how to notice the particular hush that falls over a stand of lodgepole pine just before an animal moves through it, how to walk a fence line at dusk and count the places where a man might have lied to you about where his property ended and yours began. Her mother had died when Bethany was 9, of a fever not unlike the one that would one day take her husband. And after that the girl had kept the cabin, kept her father's supper warm, and kept her own counsel, because there was no one else in that lonesome quarter of the territory to keep it for her. She grew into a young woman who was underestimated everywhere she went, on account of being quiet, and on account of being a woman who worked alone, and she learned early that this underestimation was not always a wound. Sometimes it was a door left carelessly open. People spoke around her, forgot she was listening, revealed things to her they would never have revealed to a man they feared. She met Daniel Calloway at a harvest dance in Piney Ford when she was 22, and what drew her to him was not his easy laugh, though he had one, but the way he asked her opinion on the drainage of his family's north pasture, and then actually waited to hear her answer. Daniel's people had been among the first to run cattle in that valley, and the Calloway name still meant something at the mercantile and in the pews of the little clapboard church, though the fortune behind the name had thinned considerably by the time it reached Daniel's generation. They married in the spring, and for 11 years Bethany kept house at Calloway Draw, a modest spread pressed up against the timber line where the creek ran loud with snowmelt every April and near silent by August. It was there she came to know the textures of that kind of life in a way that no book could have taught her. The particular gold of lantern light thrown across a supper table on a night when the wind was working itself into something serious outside. The long, maddening delay between sending a wire from the telegraph office in town and receiving any answer at all, so that news of a birth or a death might reach a person a full week after it had happened. The way the saloon on Front Street functioned as a kind of nervous system for the whole valley, carrying gossip and warning alike faster than any newspaper. The rhythm of packing the root cellar and the hay barn before the first heavy snow closed the pass, because a family that had not stored enough by October was a family gambling with its own survival. She learned to recognize the particular clank and shuffle of livestock settling for the night, and to know by the pit. Ch of an unfamiliar sound that something in the dark had changed. She learned patience the way other women learned embroidery as an ordinary domestic skill, useful and unremarkable, until the day it was the only thing standing between her and disaster. Daniel was a good husband, if a distracted one, prone to riding out alone for hours at a stretch, and Bethany never asked him where he went, because a marriage built on that kind of watching wore a woman down faster than any hardship. What she did notice, though she thought little of it at the time, was that Daniel's grandmother, a stern, silver-haired woman named Ruth who lived with them the last 2 years of her life, would sometimes wake in the night speaking a name that was not a Calloway name at all, and would grow strangely evasive if asked about her people before they came to Wyoming. Ruth kept in an old cedar chest at the foot of her bed a single locket she would not let anyone else touch, and a family Bible with an early page torn cleanly out. And when Bethany once asked her gently why the page was missing, the old woman had only said that some names were safer forgotten than spoken, and had closed the subject as firmly as she closed the chest. Bethany had let it go. There was hay to put up, and a husband to feed, and a life that seemed, in those years, ordinary enough to require no further excavation. It would be a decade before she understood that her mother-in-law's silence had been the first thread of the very rope that would one day pull her up a mountainside toward the truth. The fall, when it came, did not come all at once, which was in some ways crueler than if it had. It began the winter Daniel's grandmother died, when the chest at the foot of her bed was quietly moved to the attic, and its riddle went with it, unspoken and unsolved, because grief has no patience for old mysteries. 2 years after that, Daniel himself began to cough in a way that worried Bethany, a dry, insistent sound that deepened through that autumn until it rattled in his chest at night like something loose in a drawer. The doctor who rode out from Piney Ford, a tired, competent man named Whitfield, did what could be done, which in that country and that decade was not very much. And by the second week of January, Daniel Calloway was dead, and Bethany stood in a black dress in a church that had baptized 4 generations of his family, receiving condolences from people who would, within the year, stand by and watch her lose everything that family had built. The trouble was the note. Daniel's father had mortgaged Calloway draw a decade earlier to Ashcroft and Sons, the only bank of any size between Piney Ford and the rail junction 30 miles east, in order to weather a bad cattle season, and the debt had never been fully retired, only managed, refinanced, carried forward on the strength of the Calloway name, and the tacit understanding that men who had known each other's fathers did not foreclose on one another over a difficult year. Bethany discovered in the weeks after the funeral that this understanding had apparently died along with her husband. Warren Ashcroft, who now ran the bank his grandfather Nathaniel had founded, called on her personally, hat in hand, voice soft with what he called regret, and explained that the note was badly in arrears, that the bank's own directors were pressing him, that he had regrettably no choice. Bethany asked for time. She offered to work the place herself, to hire on help through calving season, to sell off stock to bring the payments current. Warren Ashcroft was sorry. Warren Ashcroft was always sorry, in that particular way men are sorry when sorrow costs them nothing. By the first thaw, the bank held Calloway draw outright. The herd had been sold at auction to pay the remainder, and Bethany found herself standing in the yard of the only home she had known as a married woman, watching a stranger's wagon haul off the last of the furniture that was not strictly hers to keep. She took a room above the feed store in town, the cheapest lodging Piney Ford offered a widow of her situation, and she took in mending and did what wash she could find, and she watched her small store of coin dwindle through the spring and into the summer with the particular, silent terror of a woman who has already lost the worst thing she thought she had to lose, and is discovering there is further yet to fall. It was saloon gossip, oddly enough, that saved her, filtering up through the washwater grapevine the way it always did in that town, talk of the county's autumn tax auction, where parcels forfeited for unpaid assessments would go to whoever bid the least anyone was willing to pay. Most of what would be sold was worthless, everyone agreed. Rock timber too remote to haul out profitably. high pasture that iced over by October and stayed treacherous until June. One parcel in particular drew a kind of amused, superstitious head-shaking whenever. It came up a stretch of broken ground the old-timers called Widow's Notch, up along the shoulder of the range above what had once, 90 years before, been the only pass through that country before the rail line made it obsolete. Nobody would run stock there. Nobody would say precisely why, except that their grandfathers hadn't liked the place, and their grandfathers had not generally troubled themselves to explain their dislikes to anyone. Bethany went to the auction with her $9.40 because she needed, more than anything else in the world just then, a piece of ground she could call her own, however poor, however cursed, however small a foothold it offered against the coming winter. The auctioneer, a dry little man named Prout who processed these forfeitures for the county, seemed almost embarrassed to take her money, and made a joke to the handful of men gathered there about the widow's notch parcel finally finding its match. A widow buying the widow's ground, and there was some low laughter at that, not unkind exactly, but not kind either. Bethany did not laugh. She signed the paper, folded the deed into her bag, and walked out of that auction yard with the single largest asset she had left in the world, 90-some acres of country nobody else wanted, and the beginning, though she could not have known it yet, of the strangest and most consequential season of her life. She rode up to see her new property on a clear morning in early September, borrowing a sound-footed mule named Ruby from the livery in exchange for a week's mending, and the ride itself told her a good deal before she ever laid eyes on the land. The trail narrowed and grew rougher the higher she climbed, until it was less a trail than a suggestion, switchbacking up through spruce and granite outcrop toward a notch in the ridgeline that, even from a mile off, had an unsettling quality to it, a narrowness that seemed to swallow the morning light rather than reflect it. She noticed, without quite knowing why she noticed, that there were no fresh cattle tracks anywhere along that upper trail, no salt licks, no rubbed bark, none of the ordinary signs of a country that any rancher used even occasionally. It was as though the whole shoulder of that mountain had been silently, collectively avoided for longer than living memory could account for. The first disturbing thing she found was not dramatic. It was a single iron wagon tire, half buried in the duff beneath a fallen spruce, rusted nearly to lace, far too large and far too old to belong to anything a piney Ford rancher would have hauled up into that country in living memory. She dug it free with her boot heel and turned it over in her hands, and something in its weight, in the crude, hand-forged quality of its rivets, unsettled her in a way she could not immediately name. She had grown up around old iron. This was older than old iron. This was the kind of ironwork her father used to point out on the rare abandoned homestead they'd pass while surveying, the kind that dated back before the railroad, before even the first waves of settlers her own grandparents' generation had followed west. She sat with that wagon tire in her lap for a long while, listening to the particular hush of that notch, a hush that seemed, absurdly, to be listening back. And then she rode on toward the heart of her new and worthless property with a curiosity that had already begun to outpace her caution. What she found, over the following days and the weeks that followed them, deepened from a single strange object into something that kept her awake long past the hour any sensible widow should have been asleep. The wagon tire, it turned out, was not alone. Deeper into the notch, where the ground folded down into a narrow defile she had not noticed from the trail, the rock slide that had clearly closed the upper pass at some point in the past had not obliterated everything beneath it, only buried it, and the summer's unusually heavy runoff had scoured a channel down through decades of accumulated scree, exposing, piece by piece, the ribs of what had once been a train of wagons. She counted the remains of at least 7, though there may have been more still buried. Pressed together in the notch as though they had been herded there or had huddled there together against something and had never left. She found the corroded remains of harness buckles. She found a child's shoe, small and stiff and terrible in the dry mountain air, and she had to sit down on a boulder for a long while after that, her hands pressed to her mouth before she could make herself keep looking. She found, wedged beneath a wagon bed that the decades had mostly rotted away, A strong box, iron-banded, its lock rusted solid, and when she worked it free and turned it over, she saw stamped into the lid, faint but legible, a name she did not recognize: the Pemberton Company. She rode back down to Piney Ford that evening with Th. E. Strongbox lashed to Ruby's saddle and her mind turning over questions faster than she could arrange them into any order. And it was in the town's small public library, 3 days later, hunting through old county records with the patient, unhurried thoroughness her father had taught her, that she found the first thread of an explanation and the first true chill of the whole affair. 90 years before, in 1821, a company of 12 wagons had set out from the railhead to establish what the old records called New Hope Settlement, a school and refuge for orphan children, funded by the personal fortune of a Boston philanthropist named Josiah Pemberton, who had entrusted the entire undertaking, the charter, the endowment, a significant sum in gold coin meant to build and sustain the settlement for its first decade, to a wagon master named Thomas Harrow and a small company of families and hired men. According to the single surviving account, written by one of the party's 2 scouts, a man named Ezra Colby, the company had been caught by an early and catastrophic blizzard in the high pass above what would later become Piney Ford, and the entire party, wagons and all, had been lost to the storm and to a rock slide that sealed the pass behind them, a tragedy from which only Colby and his fellow scout, a young man named Nathaniel Ashcroft, had escaped alive to carry the terrible news back to civilization. Bethany sat very still in that library with Ezra Colby's 90-year-old account open in front of her, and read the name Nathaniel Ashcroft 3 times before she trusted herself to believe it, because it was, of course, the same name that hung in gilt letters above the door of the bank that had taken her home. She had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that Warren Ashcroft's fortune had simply grown the ordinary way frontier fortunes grew, through land and cattle and the patient compounding of interest. She had not imagined that its very first seed might have been planted in the same notch where she had just found a dead child's shoe. The contradiction, once she went looking for it, was not hard to find, and it was the kind of small, exact, damning detail that her father had always told her mattered more than any grand accusation. Colby's account placed the disaster 3 miles north of Widow's Notch, at a different pass entirely, one that Bethany had ridden through herself on her way up, and that showed no sign whatsoever of ever having carried a wagon train, let alone lost one. The discrepancy might have been an old man's failing memory, except that Colby had written his account within a month of the supposed tragedy, while it was still fresh, while surely a scout who knew that country as his living depended on it would not confuse one pass for another 3 miles distant. She began cautiously, quietly asking questions in town, framed as a widow's idle curiosity about the history of her own strange new property, and she found to her mounting unease that the town's collective memory of Widow's Notch was oddly uniform in its vagueness, as though generations of Piney Ford residents had inherited not a story but the studied absence of one, a shared instinct to look away from that notch and ask no further. The first true warning came less than a week after she began asking. A man she did not recognize, well-dressed, soft-spoken, arrived at her rented room above the feed store with an offer to buy Widow's Notch back from her for $400, an almost absurd sum for 90 acres of cursed rock that had sold for $9 scarcely a month before. And when she asked reasonably why anyone would pay so extravagantly for ground universally agreed to be worthless, the man only smiled and said that some buyers had sentimental attachments that outran good sense, and that she would be wise to take the money and be glad of her good fortune. Bethany declined. She was learning slowly that the value of a thing was very often measured most honestly by how badly someone else wanted to take it from you before you understood what it was. The pressure, once she refused the money, did not stay polite for long. Her mending work began mysteriously to dry up, clients she had served faithfully for months suddenly finding excuses to take their business elsewhere. The livery stable, without explanation, declined to lend her Ruby the mule again, forcing her to arrange a longer, harder walk up to the notch on her own 2 feet. Someone left a dead crow, its neck deliberately broken, on the step outside her rented room one morning, with no note attached and none needed. And Bethany stood over that small, terrible bird for a long moment, feeling the old, familiar cold settle into her chest. The cold of being watched by people who did not intend to let her keep whatever she had found. She thought more than once in those weeks of simply taking the $400 and walking away, and told herself each time that Daniel would have been ashamed of her for it. Though in her more honest moments she suspected it was not Daniel's memory driving her forward so much as her own long-buried refusal to be underestimated one more time by men who assumed a poor widow could be frightened into forgetting what she had seen. It was Dr. Whitfield, of all people, the same tired man who had failed to save her husband, who gave her the second true thread of the mystery, offered almost by accident over coffee at the Mercantile. When he mentioned that old Ruth Calloway, Daniel's grandmother, had once let slip to him during a fever years before her death that her own maiden name had not always been what the family Bible now recorded, and that she had been raised as a small girl by relations who had fled Piney Ford under some old cloud nobody in the family ever spoke of again. Bethany went home that night and climbed to the attic where Ruth's cedar chest had sat forgotten since the old woman's death, and opened it at last with hands that would not quite stay steady. Inside, beneath a folded shawl, she found the locket Ruth had never let anyone touch, and prying it open with a hairpin, she found a miniature portrait of a stern young man she did not recognize, and engraved on the locket's inner rim, worn nearly smooth but still legible if she tilted it toward the lamp, a single name: Harrow. She understood, sitting alone in that attic with the locket cold in her palm, that her husband's family had not simply happened to end up owning land near the site of an old tragedy. They were the tragedy's own bloodline, quietly renamed, quietly scattered, quietly kept silent for 3 generations by a fear so old it had outlived anyone who could still explain its precise shape. Someone 90 years ago had wanted the Harrow name gone from that country as thoroughly as the Harrow wagons had been buried in that notch. And it was only by the strangest turn of fortune, the accident of an unpaid tax note and a $9 auction, that a Harrow descendant's own widow had walked back up into that notch and begun, without ever intending to, calling the dead by their right names again. She went to Warren Ashcroft directly, because she had never been a woman who preferred to wait for trouble to find her when she could walk out and meet it on her own ground instead. She brought the strongbox, still sealed, and the locket, and Ezra Colby's contradictory old account, and she laid them out on the polished surface of his own desk and watched his composed, banker's face for whatever it might involuntarily tell her. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and the silence in that office had a texture to it, a held-breath quality that told Bethany more clearly than any confession could have that she had finally found the exact center of the thing. Then he offered her, in a voice gone suddenly much less soft, a great deal more money than $400, and when she still declined, he told her, without quite threatening her outright, that a woman alone in that country, digging up matters 90 years buried, might find that the past did not always stay conveniently in the ground once disturbed, and that Piney Ford had a long memory for people who made trouble for the families who had built it. Bethany left his office that afternoon understanding that she was no longer merely curious. She was in danger, and the danger had a name, and the name was carved in gilt letters above the very bank that held the mortgage papers on half the town. She did not go to the sheriff, because the sheriff's own election, she had learned by then through the same saloon gossip that had first sent her toward the auction, had been quietly financed by Ashcroft money 2 elections running, and she did not trust that any complaint she made would travel further than Warren Ashcroft's own desk before it was smothered. Instead, she went back up to Widow's Notch one final time, alone in the gray hour before a September storm broke over the range, because she had come to believe, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that the strongbox alone would not be enough, that there was something further up in that notch waiting to be found, something that would make the truth undeniable even to a town that had spent 90 years training itself not to look. The wind was working itself into something serious by the time she reached the defile, The same low, gathering pressure in the air that she remembered from childhood evenings when her father would glance at the sky and quietly begin securing the shutters. And she worked quickly, scraping back the last of the loosened scree from around the buried wagons with hands that had gone numb with cold and urgency both. It was there, in the last wagon bed, half crushed beneath a granite slab that had clearly fallen deliberately rather than in any natural slide, that she found what the 90 RS had been guarding most carefully of all. The remains of a man who had not died of blizzard or accident, laid out with a care that spoke of burial rather than catastrophe. A rusted pistol beside him bearing an engraved monogram that matched the locket in her pocket exactly. And beneath his ribs, protected all those decades by an oilcloth wrapping that had somehow held a folded letter in a hand she recognized from the county archive as Ezra Colby's own. A private confession, never meant for any eye but the guilt-ridden one that wrote it. Admitting that he and Nathaniel Ashcroft had diverted the Pemberton Company into that notch under the pretense of a shortcut, had murdered Thomas Harrow when he discovered their intention to steal the endowment, had triggered the rock slide themselves to seal the wagons and the rest of the party inside rather than leave any living witness, and had ridden back to civilization to tell a grieving nation a story of blizzard and misfortune that not one soul had ever thought to question. Because who would think to doubt two heartbroken survivors weeping over the deaths of their own dear company? The storm broke over her as she read the last of it, and Bethany Calloway sat in that notch in the driving rain with a dead man's confession in her hands and understood, with a clarity that felt almost like peace after so many months of fear, that she was no longer merely uncovering an old tragedy. She was closing a debt that had waited 90 years for someone with the right blood, the right grief, and the right stubborn refusal to be frightened off to come and collect it. She brought the confession, the locket, the monogrammed pistol, and Josiah Pemberton's original charter, still legible beneath its wax seal within the strongbox, down out of the mountains and directly to the county courthouse rather than to Warren Ashcroft's desk, because she had learned by then precisely which doors in Piney Ford could be quietly closed against her and which could not. She laid the evidence before a circuit judge who happened, by good fortune, to be passing through that week on his regular rounds, a stern, unhurried man who read Ezra Colby's confession twice through without once looking up, and who then asked, in a voice gone very quiet, to see the pistol's monogram again. Word of what she had found moved through Piney Ford faster than any telegraph line could have carried it, faster even than the old saloon gossip, because this was not idle talk, but the sound of a town's foundation shifting beneath its own feet. Warren Ashcroft did not come to the courthouse that day, and did not come the day after, and within the month it was known throughout the valley that the bank's own directors, alarmed at last for their own reputations rather than his, had quietly removed him from the position his grandfather's crime had built for him. Justice, in that remote country, moved slowly and imperfectly, and Bethany understood from the first that no court in the territory would ever fully untangle a theft and 2 murders 90 years buried, nor restore to any grave the years its occupants had been denied. But the gold coin recovered from the Pemberton strongbox, once its provenance was established beyond doubt, was placed by the court into a trust exactly as old Josiah Pemberton had first intended, and within 2 years a modest school and refuge rose on a gentle rise above Piney Ford bearing the name New Hope, 91 years late but built at last. The Harrow name, restored to its rightful place in the county's own records, was restored also quietly and without fanfare to Bethany's own standing in that valley, and the court, weighing her discovery, her peril, and her direct descent through Ruth's long-hidden line, awarded her a share of the recovered estate sufficient to reclaim Calloway draw from the bank that had so coldly taken it, and to hold it, this time, outright and in her own name alone. She stood the following spring at the gate of that reclaimed home, in the same lantern light that had once seemed to her only a marker of ordinary domestic evenings, and understood it now as something closer to a signal fire, a small, steady flame that had in its own quiet way been burning in that family for 3 generations, waiting for someone willing to walk back up into the dark, and read what it had been trying to illuminate all along. She thought of her father, teaching her to read a sky before a storm broke over her. She thought of Ruth, guarding a torn page and a silent locket for reasons she had never lived to explain aloud. She thought of Thomas Harrow, buried with such strange, deliberate care by the very men who had killed him, as though even in murder some remnant of conscience had insisted he be laid to rest rather than simply abandoned. $9.40 had bought her in the end, not a worthless notch of cursed high country, but the one thing 90 years of silence had never managed. To bury completely. The truth, waiting patiently, exactly where someone of her particular blood and her particular courage was always, eventually, going to come and find it. Settle in, we had asked you at the beginning, and let us tell you the story of Bethany Calloway, and now you know it entire, from the auction yard to the notch to the quiet, hard-won piece of a home reclaimed in her own name. Thank you truly for spending this time with Bethany and with us. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things and overlooked people are so often worth a second look, and we would love for you to leave a comment telling us where you would have found the courage to keep climbing when the whole town told you to turn back. Before you go, we will leave you with this. Has there ever been a piece of your own life, a name, a silence, a small locked thing in a forgotten chest, that some quiet instinct told you was worth investigating long before you had any proof it mattered at all? We would love to know. Until our next story together, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.